In today's new episode of Missing, we speak about the disappearance of Alice Corbett from Northampton, Massachusetts on November 13th, 1925. This is actually the 100-year anniversary of Alice's disappearance. And we're once again joined by our friend Ross Griffiths, the Worcester State University Archives librarian. And he shares with us a story about 20-year-old Alice, who was a student at Smith College in Northampton at the time of her disappearance. And Ross has joined us for the entire Bennington Triangle series that we did. We love the way he breaks down a story, and if you do as well, make sure to scroll back and check out that series. Okay, so please follow us on social media at MissingCSM. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Ross Griffiths. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Ross Griffiths. Ross, how are you today?
I'm great. Happy to be here as always.
Happy to have you back. We last left you wrapping up the Bennington Triangle mysteries, and we had such a good time in those conversations that we just couldn't leave you alone. We had to have you back on to talk about other mysteries. You've had a number of episodes with us, and I know a lot of people know who you are already, but can you just refresh some memories? Anybody who doesn't know, can you give a little background?
Yeah, I'm Ross Griffiths. I'm a librarian and archivist at Worcester State University. My background is history, as well as some museum studies stuff. And I have a side interest in folklore and mythology. And I'm very, very interested in the use of primary sources, correspondence, archives, photographs, newspaper articles, and the ways that those primary sources can give us insights into some of these folklores and legends and famous criminal cases that we talk about sometimes. And I think we saw that with the Bennington Triangle case, maybe a little bit with the Etta Reel case. And today's case, I think, seems like there isn't quite as much information out there. But the primary sources do, I think, reveal some interesting facts that I think your listeners will enjoy. And there were two reasons that I wanted to do this. The first was that the Alice Corbett case we're going to talk about today is referenced in two other cases we talked about, which was Paula Weldon and Etta Reel as another missing college student. But this is also the 100th anniversary. She disappeared in November of 1925. So anniversaries are always good times to look back at things and maybe talk about them a little bit.
Well, I also think that it's really good to talk about these mysteries that on the surface don't seem to have a lot of information. You just said there doesn't seem to be a lot here, but we've had situations where we don't have a lot of information and then family members will reach out or something and they'll provide information. So just getting the story out there is, I think, more important than packing enough content in for a 40-minute episode. If we don't have a lot of information, that's fine.
And this case is an important part of local history in Northampton, and it's a part of the history of Smith College. So her name has not been forgotten, and her case hasn't been forgotten. And so I think it's always nice to kind of, when you see these names pop up, to talk about who these people were and what happened to them and why we still talk about them 100 years later.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And on that topic, can you tell us who Alice Corbett was?
Yeah, let's jump right on in. Alice Corbett was a 20-year-old student at Smith College back in 1925. She was from Utica, New York originally, which is a couple hours farther west. She was a student in good standing. She had a boyfriend named Thomas Sterling, who there were some mixed reports as to how serious they were, but it sounded like they had the kind of relationship that might have led to marriage eventually. But let's first start talking about the place where this happened, because I think that Northampton and Smith College are sort of the main characters of the story. Northampton is one of these beautiful little New England towns. It's one of the old New England cities, settled in 1654. When I was doing research for this project, I learned there was a witch trial in Northampton back in the 1670s, which I'd never heard about, predating the Salem case. It was the center of revivalism, religious revivalism in the 1800s. And because it's located in the center of the Pioneer Valley, it became a kind of industrial hub back in the later 19th century. But it's known today as being very counterculture, artsy. It's not too far from the Berkshires. So there's a little spillover for some of the Berkshire events in the summer. But it's also a college town. There are a number of colleges in the area, including Smith College, located in Northampton. Smith College is a very elite women's college founded 1871. And it was part of the Seven Sisters colleges in the Northeast. So don't ask me to name all of them. I can't remember all the names. But these are women's colleges that were emerging in the late 19th, early 20th century. And the women that went to these colleges often had brothers that went to Ivy League colleges. But this is back when the Ivies were all boys. And so these women colleges were attracting women from high status families. And so that was sort of the environment in which Alice was studying and learning during this period of time. There are about 2,000 students on the campus of Smith College back in 1925. So it's not a tiny college, but it's not huge. But it's large enough that I think that there was a lot going on, and there were a lot of different activities students were involved with. Something terrible happened on the campus of Smith College on the morning of Friday, the 13th of November, 1925. That was early in the hours of that morning. A student in the Park House dormitory smelled the odor of gas. And when she went to investigate, she found the body of one of her classmates, a woman named Jean Robeson, lying on the floor of a small kitchenette located on the third floor of this dormitory. And there was a 2-burner stove, gas stove in this dorm. The police were called. When they investigated, they came to the conclusion that Jean had gone into that kitchen earlier that evening to do some ironing. And she either accidentally turned on the stove, which you could do back in those days because they had handles rather than knobs, or she turned on the stove and didn't strike a match in time to light it. This was the old stove that didn't have automatic strikers. So turn the gas on, you light it with a match. Somehow she became overcome with gas. She lost consciousness. There was a head injury, which she incurred by falling to the floor. The police ruled out suicide right away. They also ruled out foul play. This was an accident. The campus was obviously devastated by this. Anytime there's a death on campus, it's a terrible thing. But on a somewhat smaller campus with a popular student, it was particularly bad. So we can kind of imagine what the early morning was like as word spread about Jean Robeson's death. At around 8 a.m., Alice Corbett, who lived a 5-minute walk away from Park House in the Clark House residence hall, wearing normal street clothes and a hat, puts on a yellow rain slicker, which will be important later on, and she steps out of Clark House onto Elm Street and is never seen again. She does not come back for lunch. Her classmates become worried. They go to her room. They find a note in an unsealed envelope addressed to her mother. And the contents of the note gave them some concern about Alice's mental state. The original newspaper articles about this case were very cagey about the note for the first few days, but later on the contents of the note was released. And I'm going to read the note that as it was published in the newspaper. I've got to die. I cannot go on living. College education is bunk. It teaches you to think of things you would be better off without. If people want to think I'm doing this because I was disappointed in love, I want to say there was no truth in it. Mother, I am going home. It's interesting how authorities handled this note initially, because the first articles in newspapers said it showed a disturbed state of mind, but it didn't mention suicide. I think this reads like a suicide note. This is an intention to die.
That very clearly does, yeah.
Yeah. Why they didn't say that up front, or were the contents of the note released secretly? Was it leaked to the media? We don't know. But within a couple of days, the contents of the note's released. And something else comes out early on. The police speak to Sterling, who was Alice's boyfriend. And he had said the night before, Alice had requested him to buy her poison. I couldn't find details about this conversation or what she actually asked him to do. There were poisonous substances you could purchase at drugstores back then that had utility, cleaning products or ant killers or whatever. I was not able to track down better details as to what this conversation was. It doesn't seem like he was overly alarmed. Maybe he thought she was being dramatic. It's hard to say. We don't know what his mindset was, but that's what he told the police, that she had said she wanted to buy poison. So we have this report she was trying to obtain poison. We have this very dire note left behind in her room. Initial newspaper articles said that she was close friends with Jean Robeson, but that turns out not to be the case. Several days later, the papers report she didn't know Jean Robeson, which makes her disappearance look a lot less spontaneous. People initially thought, she was upset over his death. She freaked out. She ran off. That doesn't seem to be what happened. It seems like this might have been an intentional departure. Because of the suicidal nature of the note, the police immediately began searching waterways in the area. Now, the Connecticut River runs right through Northampton. It's about 1.5 miles from where Alice's residence was. They had boatmen out on the river immediately. They drained a pond on campus. They searched the waterways as thoroughly as they could. Didn't find anything. They also sent groups of searchers into the woods. Corbett was known as someone who enjoyed hiking. And there used to be public transit routes down to Mount Tom, which is about 8 or 9 miles south of Northampton. And she used to like hiking out there. They sent groups of Boy Scouts, and the Kiwanis Club sent men out to search the woods. There was no evidence that turned up. And this case, more than any other we've talked about, really seems characterized by false sightings. Because once the Corbett case starts getting regional coverage, there are enormous numbers of reports that come in. I mean, page after page after page of newspaper articles. Alice Corbett seen in Providence, Rhode Island. Corbett seen here, Corbett seen there. It seems like that yellow rain slicker became this thing that everybody was looking for. And a lot of young women wearing yellow rain slickers may have been mistaken for Corbett. Of all of these sightings, the one the police considered most likely was a young woman who was seen in East Hampton, which is not too far south of Northampton. This woman was seen in various places around East Hampton, including going into a drugstore to buy a sandwich of the type that Alice used to like. This is back in the old days when drugstores had lunch counters in them. So she buys, this young woman in the yellow rain slicker buys this sandwich. She's seen at bus stops. She looks a little bedraggled to some people. Like, her hair is kind of a mess. Doesn't look like she's doing so well. And the police really focus their searches on East Hampton. But again, they find all these people who claim to see this young woman, but they can't track her down. They don't know if it's Alice. And then the sightings begin to expand. There is a young woman who looks like her seen getting out of a red roadster at a state psychiatric hospital in Connecticut. There are sightings of her in New York. There are sightings of her in Ontario, Canada. The story hits the National Wire Service, and it wouldn't be a missing persons case unless a psychic shows up. So there's a psychic in Oklahoma who tells the police in Northampton through a telegram that he has a vision that Alice Corbett is living in Columbus, Ohio, and he gives an address. And when the Columbus, Ohio police go to the address, the house doesn't exist. There is a street by that name, but the house doesn't exist. The psychic claimed that she was there on her way to Washington State. Well, we don't have evidence I've been able to find that Corbett had any connection to Ohio or Washington State. So again, you have this wild goose chase started off by a psychic. By December, Mr. Corbett, her dad, hires the Pinkertons to assist with the investigation. And there does seem to be a bit of a split of the theories at that point. It seems more and more that the local police think she might have gone off into the woods because the waterways have been searched so thoroughly without any results. The Pinkertons think she might be living under a false name. And once that gets out, there are all these reports of factory girls as far west as New York State, Troy, New York. There's a woman working in a factory. We think it's Alice Corbett. Turns out not to be Alice Corbett. So there are these multiple stories of people seeing her. I will share a picture for the show notes of what she looks like. She looks like a kind of ordinary person. Like, there aren't any really distinguishing characteristics, brown hair, brown eyes, or gray eyes. But it's that yellow rain slicker everyone's looking for. So this goes on for many weeks and many months. and nothing of her turns up. Sterling is exonerated as a suspect. The police lose interest in him. Within a few weeks, either he had an alibi, there just was some compelling reason the police felt as if he really didn't have anything to do with her disappearance. He did end up getting kicked out of school. He was an Amherst student, and he stopped going to class at some point that spring. And the reports indicate that he was eventually expelled, not because of the connection to the Corbett case, but because he was not keeping up with his studies, possibly under stress. There were also cases of some bad actors who show up. There was a really bizarre story that came out from a guy claiming to be a utility lineman working on Mount Tom, who claims that he and his colleagues were held at gunpoint by a young woman resembling Alice Corbett who demanded food. And they gave her their food, and they said she ate 5 sandwiches and drank 2 liters of coffee. And later on, this guy turns out to be a fraud. But this became this thing everyone's talking about. The woman wasn't wearing the same clothing that Alice was last seen, but they thought, did Alice turn into an outlaw and live on Mount Tom? There was a message in a bottle found floating in the Connecticut River that spring. And when someone took the message out, it was presumably a note from Alice saying she was being held prisoner in a cave near Mount Tom by a group of men. The police dismissed it immediately because that cave was near a trolley stop and a highway. And they thought, well, she's so close to civilization, she can't be that lost. And then later, a group of boys came forward and confessed to creating the note in the bottle, and as a kind of bad prank. So we see what we were probably are well-meaning people who are obsessed with that yellow rain slicker, and they report anyone with a yellow rain slicker. And then we have these people who insinuate themselves into the case, either as pranksters, malicious pranksters. There was a case of a middle-aged woman who shows up at a drugstore claiming to be Alice Corbett. They said she's 45 years old. There's no way she's Corbett. They sent her back home again. The psychological theory was an interesting one because one of the trustees of Smith College was also the superintendent of the Northampton State Hospital. And so they turned to him to give statements to the media regarding mental health issues. And this is, of course, back in the 1920s. And I think some of what he said wouldn't exactly align with modern thoughts about depression. But he did seem to emphasize that there wasn't necessarily a precipitating event, that Corbett may have been suffering from long-term depression or melancholia, and that kind of disturbs your mind to the point you might act rashly. And so he was piping in with a lot of this sort of analysis of who Corbett was as a person. The Boston newspapers were interesting in this case. They took a somewhat different tone than the local newspapers did, and I think the tone was a bit more sensationalistic. The Boston papers had sent reporters out to talk to Sterling, talk to other people. And Sterling accused reporters of stealing love letters from his room that he had written to Alice and reading those letters. There were rumors circulating, some of which showed up in print, of hundreds of letters between the two of them. I got a sense the Boston papers were really playing up the idea of a romantic split between these two people, precipitating Alice's breakdown or whatever happened. So it's hard to say what the case was with that, but they definitely took a stronger interest in this kind of broken-hearted college woman angle. And I think it's a good reminder where if you're reading about a case like this, read broadly, because some newspapers will say things that other newspapers aren't saying, and they may shed some light onto the story.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
There's something that happened in the summer of 1926 that I want to talk about. It's a little bit tangential, but I'm going to loop it back to the Corbett case. In July of 1926, and it's a bit gruesome, so bear with me as I tell you. I'll be as clinical about it as I can. The body of a dismembered woman was found in several boxes outside of a cemetery in Mattapan, which is kind of in the Boston area. Because the boxes had some commercial markings on them, they were traced to a doctor who was part of a husband and wife abortionist team. And this young woman was identified as a young woman named Edith Green, who had gone to this husband and wife team to seek an abortion and had died as a result of it. And he dismembered her as a way of disposing of her body. It's unclear why he left it in boxes by the cemetery. Some people suggested he was hoping to find an open grave to dispose of it in, and it didn't work. But in that cemetery is the grave of a young woman named Susanna Geary, who died in 1905. She was also dismembered by an abortionist after she died from an illegal abortion. And that case got a tremendous amount of news coverage in Boston because it revealed the existence of this kind of abortion racket running out of storefronts. And what had happened in the Geary case was that the bagmen who had been assigned the role of disposing of her body after she died were supposed to take her out to the Atlantic Ocean. They left her in a body of water near Winthrop, and that's where her remains were found. So we have this sort of bizarre situation. These two women who had been accidentally killed by abortionists and dismembered and disposed of were found very close to each other, even though these deaths happened decades apart. The Edith Green case actually did attract the attention of the Corbett investigation because they wanted to make sure this dead woman from the Boston area was not Alice Corbett. They ruled her out. But the cases were connected. And there's one other link we should talk about. On that day of Friday the 13th of November, 1925, when Jean Robeson died and Alice Corbett disappeared, another woman in Northampton died. This is a woman named Jessie Lyman. She was well known in Northampton because she had worked at the county clerk's office. And at the time of her death, she was working as the secretary of a faculty member at Amherst College. Jessie Lyman died of a quote unquote illegal operation. This does kind of open up some areas of speculation about the Corbett case. I couldn't find any evidence that anyone thought that Alice Corbett was pregnant or was seeking an abortion. But these other cases that happened either around the same time or tangentially to her involving that issue does tell us something about the time in which she was living, that a young woman who was pregnant might have faced very limited options. A lot of the people who ran these illicit abortion clinics were real lowlifes who would not hesitate if someone died, if something went wrong, to abandon that woman on the street or to dispose of her body. And so I think when we look back at these old cases, particularly before the 1960s, of young, healthy women disappearing and never being seen again, that is one area to consider. So it doesn't really have to do with the Corbett case, but it does kind of connect with the case in some way. And I think it was something worth talking about, especially in the larger context of this time and place.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So that wasn't the same doctor who had the accidental death and then dismembered the patient, right?
The Geary case was decades before, and those guys were all sent to jail. And the Edith Green case, they were also apprehended and sent to jail. It was just two different cases. But it does tell you something about what these places were like and what the people who did these illegal abortions were sometimes like, and the kind of lengths they would go to cover up what they did. So the case kind of just rolls along. The reward is never withdrawn. The search never stops. Mr. Corbett is paying searchers to go out into the woods and to continue looking. There were repeated searches of waterways. Remember, this is an industrial area. There are lots of canals for water-powered mills. These canals are drained regularly for cleaning. And every time the canals were drained, they were checked, the dams were checked, the machinery was checked. So the search really never ended. It continued. Even when the water froze over, when it thawed out, they would check again. A really exhaustive search. And this is one reason I think the Northampton police thought she wasn't in the water. They thought she was probably out in the woods somewhere. And this is really where the case kind of stayed until 1928, when another Smith College student disappears mysteriously, also on a Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th of January.
Stop it. Stop.
I'm not kidding. And the papers mentioned this. On unlucky Friday the 13th of January, 1928, Frances St. John Smith, who was 18, she was a freshman, turns up missing. She had attended breakfast that morning. She lived in Dewey House. She attended breakfast that morning. Around lunchtime, a friend of hers dropped a note off in her room inviting her to lunch the next day. When she didn't show up for lunch, the friend checks the room. The note is unopened. And it seems like Frances had not been back to her room since Friday the 13th. We have a sort of instant replay of the Corbett case. Police are involved, widespread news coverage, many, many false sightings. One interesting detail about the Frances Smith case is this. One of her best friends at Smith College was a young woman named Anne Morrow. Well, less than 10 years after her disappearance, Anne Morrow became famous for marrying Charles Lindbergh, and the world famous aviator. And Anne Morrow Lindbergh was the mother of the Lindbergh baby.
Wow.
And so the mother of Lindbergh baby, good friends with Frances Smith at Smith College, who disappears mysteriously. And some of the newspaper coverage actually shows a picture of Anne Morrow in discussing the case, because her father was the ambassador to Mexico. It was kind of a big deal. So she was a bit of a famous family to begin with. And so the Frances Smith case, again, rolls on and on. There's a big reward. No evidence as to what happens to her. Lots of false sightings, as I mentioned. There's a fake extortion attempt against the father. During the investigation, the state investigator's name was Joseph Daly, who worked on both the Corbett and the Smith case. He dies. He goes into the hospital for appendix surgery, and there's complications, and he dies. You know, the Corbett family had a lot of very warm feelings for him. About 9 months after Alice disappeared, they gave him a gold watch engraved with a thank you message for all the work he did on the Corbett case. And I think that tells us something about how seriously the police took this, and even the family of the missing young woman who was never found expresses their gratitude to the chief detective who was in charge of the case. So he never lives to see either of these cases resolved. The Frances Smith case is sadly resolved in March of 1929. March 29th, workers about 21 miles south on the Connecticut River are trying to recover the body of a utility worker who'd fallen in and drowned. And in some driftwood along the shores of the river in Longmeadow, they find the remains of Frances Smith. And the way they're able to identify the remains is she had several pieces of unique dental work. And her dentist was able to examine the teeth and verify that it was in fact her. Her parents her parents doubted at first that it was her, but there was what seems a pretty conclusive identity. In fact, the remains were wearing clothing that conformed with what Frances Smith was last wearing. There was no cause of death determined. So we don't know how or why Frances Smith ended up in the Connecticut River, but it does, and it did at the time, open up some new avenues of thought about the Corbett case. That is it possible that Alice could have gone into the river, jumped, been pushed, fallen in, and never been found? And that's an open question. The fact that Frances Smith was found and Alice wasn't, does that increase the odds or decrease the odds? I think it's difficult to say. There was no lack of intense searching. There was no lack of expertise as it was available at the time. There was no lack of concern on the part of the police. It was just that no trace of her was ever turned up at any point. A number of years later, almost on the anniversary of the discovery of Frances Smith's body, this would be March 30th, 1936, there's a little bit of a flood in Northampton, and the flood waters expose the skeleton of a young woman found buried in a shallow grave along the shores of the Connecticut River. I can't find evidence as to where that investigation went. They all said maybe it's Alice Corbett, but there's no further follow-up. So it would indicate to me that it was either identified as someone else or the remains were never identified. But I think we might presume that Corbett would have had, she's upper middle class, would probably had a dentist, would probably have had some dental work. It seems like there might have been ways of identifying these remains, even with forensics as it was back then. So if I were guessing, I would say these remains are probably ruled out as belonging to Alice, and they may have never been identified as far as we know. Thomas Sterling does not live a long life. He gets married, goes off to Michigan, to Detroit. He dies of tuberculosis in 1936 as a young man. And so whatever knowledge he might have had or didn't have died with him. And the case was never resolved. This is where we are today, all these years later. Her name is well represented in, sort of lore of the area. Smith College Archives was very helpful when I contacted them. They have a whole file on this case, which they shared a lot of scans with me, including correspondence with the college president regarding, family members concerned about the safety of their daughters and what's happening at Smith College. And there have been a couple of short articles written about the case, this sort of the curse of Friday the 13th. and sort of how it kind of spooked people on campus for many years afterwards. But that's really where the trail ends for Alice Corbett. We don't know what happened to her. We can guess. The one last thing that I would mention is that one of the areas of searching they did was in Greenwich Village, New York. Sterling had been talking to the police, and he paints this picture that to me is very tantalizing of Alice's personality. We don't get a sense of who she was, but that kind of read between the lines of what the newspaper article says that Sterling said to the police. Corbett sounds like she might have had some conflicts with her father over her atheism. There was some suggestion that Alice was an atheist, and back in those days, nice middle class girls were not atheists, and her dad was kind of traditional. And if we think about it, the letter she wrote was to her mother, not to her father. And it does happen when kids go away to college. They sometimes pick up philosophies of life that put them at odds with their conservative parents back home. This is kind of an old story. I also thought about The Great Gatsby and this aura of nihilism of the 1920s, post World War I, post Spanish flu, huge amounts of death. And that there was this sort of concern in media about young people straying from traditional paths and embracing unconventional philosophies. And so it seems like Sterling had sort of painted a picture of Alice to the police that led them to think that she was living in Greenwich Village, quote unquote, finding herself, working some job, typing, writing poetry or writing short fiction or something. That never panned out. But it does give us sort of a tantalizing glimpse into who Alice might have been as a personality. And there seemed to be people, including the Pinkertons, who thought that she did not die that day, that she left her life behind and went off to do something else. And in those days, that would have been easier. You could walk into a factory and give them a false name and get a room in a rooming house and set up a new identity. I'm not sure that I believe that. I mean, that's a whole other discussion of how many people actually do that. But it does leave a little window, maybe, of hope that she went on living somewhere else. But if she did, she never came back home. She never reconnected with her family or her friends. And so take from that what you will. But that is the story of Alice Corbett.
Wow. And you said before we recorded, you thought that this could go like 30 minutes or so, and you pretty much nailed it.
I got a lot of thoughts, and so I can usually come up with something.
This was absolutely riveting. I mean, I'm full of questions because of the amount of backstory that you provide for Alice's disappearance. It's not just about Alice's disappearance. It's about people's mindset during that time. And the abortion concept, it didn't even cross my mind until you brought that up. So that's wild. The man who said that he was held at gunpoint and she demanded food was determined to be a fraud. How did they figure that out? Like, did he say that he made the story up?
The papers are kind of cagey. Apparently, he was the papers tell somewhat different stories, so we're not sure. What I could piece together was it sounds like he was a former employee of the power company who had gotten fired or something, and he told this stupid story as a kind of bad prank. And so it wasn't followed up on. It was a guy who sounds like a guy who insinuated himself into a case to be a jerk.
I hear about these stories in 1925, and I picture 1925 being so civilized, and men are wearing suits, and everybody is like following the letter of the law. And it's always interesting to me to hear that people pull pranks like this in 1925.
Oh yeah, I mean, and the 20s were pretty rough and tumble. I mean, think about all around Northampton, Holyoke, and some of the other towns. They were factory towns. They were blue collar towns, and so this was during Prohibition too. Let's remember. So there was gangster activity. There would have been underground liquor being served. I got the impression that Mount Tom was a place where bandits would hide out. I don't know if that's correct, but based on some things that I was reading, it sounds like a place where people who were sort of outlaws might camp out. So yeah, there was kind of a seedy underbelly that I think our popular history kind of forgets. I think it's probably true in all eras.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chime in about the pranker thing. I mean, that still happens today in missing persons cases. Just they're all online versions, or tip line things. And you mentioned an extortion attempt on her dad. Also, still happens every day in this country with to missing, families of missing persons who have like their phone number on a missing flyer. They get calls about, saying they have their missing person, and looking for ransom and things like that. So it's funny. Same pranks, just different era.
It's human nature. These things kind of bubble up regardless of the time period. I think there are good-natured people who really, I think, want to help. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. And then there are people who are a little off the rocker, who may be a little mentally disturbed, who insinuate themselves. And then there are people that just like creating trouble and being jerks.
So are there other disappearances or other crimes that you have connected around this time period, around a Friday the 13th?
That's a good question. There are some other disappearances in the area. There were references which I didn't check up on. This may be a future episode. I don't know.
I think we should do a whole series on Friday the 13th.
Right. That's true. There was another missing woman named Bertha Mellish who disappeared, and I don't recall. I don't want to say where it was from because I can't remember the name of the place, but it was somewhere in the region. Another mysterious sort of walkabout situation where she never comes back. There are a couple of missing persons cases that are referenced, but some of those, if you follow up, those people are discovered later on. Like a lot of newspaper articles will say, just like Alice Corbett and Paula Weldon, this young woman went missing and it's a mystery. And then this young woman turns up 2 weeks later and she's living in a hotel somewhere. So there are other connections, but nothing I can nail down to Friday the 13th. And it does make me wonder, because Friday the 13th is a stigmatized date, I could imagine a person in a depressed and morbid state of mind picking that day. The Corbett case, I don't think this was, we could speculate whether it was spontaneous or not. She didn't take a lot of money with her, didn't have access to a car, but if she was really in a morbid state of mind, she might have said Friday the 13th is the day, this unlucky, this black day on the calendar. So we have to factor in the possibility that this was intentional. This was a choice based on a certain mindset of the disappeared people.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Would you read the suicide note again? I just am curious about this whole angle of religion, and I think that's a great point that she wrote it to her mom. But she also says at the end, I'm coming home. So
going home.
Going home. So that could be home to see her mom, or home, I guess, the afterlife is the implication potentially.
I thought about that. I think there's this quirk of the English language. And this is my interpretation of it. If she says to her mother who lives at her home, "Mother, I'm coming home," that implies an arrival. Whereas if she's saying to her mother who lives at home, "Mother, I'm going home," that to me implies a departure. It's a subtle difference, but I think in context of the note, and I'll read the note. I don't know if this is the note in total or whether it's just an excerpt that was published in the paper. "I've got to die. I cannot go on living. College education is bunk. It teaches you to think of things you would be better off without. If people want to think I'm doing this because I was disappointed in love, I want to say there is no truth in it. Mother, I am going home." I think it's interesting she mentioned love, because we do have this Sterling guy. And that does sound like, well, why would you think people would think that?
Yeah.
Right. He's almost inserted in there, and it almost exonerates him in the letter.
Or it's defensive, or it's her saying, I'm not doing it because of this guy. But maybe you are. Maybe there is something about this guy. Remember, these are the days when, when you're 20 years old, you're dating to marry. You're not playing the field until you're 30 years old. And every upper middle class woman was expected to marry. Very few women were going to go off into professions. There were a handful who would. But women of her class, you were husband shopping. That was a part of what college was. It was finding a guy who was going to be on your level, or who you were going to be on his level. And so the idea of a romantic disappointment, I think it might have hit harder. in this era. We can speculate either way, could hit hard or could not. But I think that there was more. I think there was something about this relationship that was weighing on her. It just based reading between the lines, it just feels like there was some element of that happening for her.
The idea that she commits suicide or even runs away from her life for the reasons she described in there is a bit peculiar too, because she could just drop out and go on living if she didn't like college.
Exactly. Is the note incomplete? Was there more to it? We don't know. If you combine it with the idea that she was an atheist, are we talking about somebody who's been disillusioned by her college experience? Has she been exposed to philosophies that shook up her sense of identity? Did she have a predisposition toward depression or anxiety? And then she's confronted with these ideas that she becomes kind of preoccupied with about the meaning of life. It does seem like she had a quote unquote philosophical bent. They describe her as somebody who was an introspective person. So I sort of have this picture of her as someone for whom identity and her place in life weighs kind of heavily on her. But I really struggle with the interpretation. This is not at least pretending to be a suicide note. It is, or it's either a real one or it's a fake one. But it's clearly, if someone I loved left a note like this, I would be frantic.
Sure.
This is an emergency situation. So I think there was a clear sort of intent and a very depressive and dark frame of mind for her. It seems pretty obvious, and the police, I think, were inclined to agree with that.
Now, if she was actually an atheist, though, would she have concluded her letter by referring to death as home?
Potentially. She didn't mention going to heaven. And there are atheists who believe in heaven. They just don't believe in God. It's a complex. I think it's a complex mindset. That can encompass a lot of different things. But I think the term "going home" I often associate with death, a kind of peaceful death, a romanticized vision of death, and that may have been what she was hinting at. But I do think that saying "going home" rather than "coming home" is the clincher here, and I think it would have been as true in 1925 English as it is today.
Speaking of 1925 English, it's interesting to me that she used the word bunk. That's really, like, instead of just saying college isn't for me.
Bunk it would have been a slang term. Here's another interesting thing. The word hitchhike. There were lots of the sightings of this young woman in a yellow rain slicker along highways. But the word hitchhike had not yet entered the lexicon. It was there, but it was kind of a slang word. So the papers had trouble describing what was happening. Young woman standing by the side of the road, hailing down cars for rides.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I thought, oh, you mean hitchhiking? Well, if this was 10 years later, they would have said hitchhiking. Did she hitchhike out of town? Were any, when you have this like huge array of sightings, it's like, I don't know how the police would have even begun to deal with that. Remember, they didn't have radio cars back then. They barely had telephones. I mean, they would have had telephones in the police station, and people had phones in their houses. But it's the world. It's still the world of telegrams and face-to-face meetings. It must have been a very daunting thing to investigate, to chase down all of these leads with the technology they had back then. But it seems like they really tried to.
Was this consistent behavior for her, or was this like a pretty quick snap? And the reason why I'm asking is, do you think that this gas leak might have had something to do with it? That maybe, I don't know. I'm not scientifically equipped to process this information, but if you were to breathe that gas in, does that affect your behaviors?
Well, the gas leak was in a different building, so the gas affected the Park House storm. She was very close to Park House, but I don't think we could say that. We could, however, say that she's described as being a pretty steady person. The papers don't, the newspapers. Interviews with family members, interviews with police officers were pretty upfront with the newspapers, but there's always going to be information they hold back. Okay, we know that. So we're not getting the whole story from newspapers. It's just what we have to work with. But it sounds like she's described as someone who was pretty steady. She's a pretty steady student in good standing. There doesn't seem evidence of her running away in the past. And I don't know. I think if you've never practiced running away, I don't know how you do it successfully. at age 20. She had about $50 on her, which is several $100s in today's money, but that wouldn't have been that unusual in the era before credit cards. It was a cash economy, and a upper middle class woman might carry, a large amount of money in her pocketbook. But no, there doesn't seem to be evidence of any of this reflecting a larger pattern, other than after the fact. Some people remarked she seemed to be in a depressed state of mind in the days or weeks leading up to this.
And you mentioned that her boyfriend at the time, Sterling, right?
Yes.
He said that she requested to him to buy her poison. Where did that information come from? Did he give that, refresh my memory, did he give that to the police?
He told that to the police, yeah. When the police tracked him down, and again, we don't have his exact words. We don't have what he told her, exactly what he told the police. It's what the police told reporters, but that she did tell him that she wanted him to buy her some poison. Now, what that triggered in my memory, and this is, again, it's tangential, but as I mentioned, poisons were available. You could buy poison at a drugstore. People who are familiar with the Lizzie Borden case, Fall River, Massachusetts, 1894, am I right about that? Before the murder of her parents, she apparently had tried to obtain prussic acid from the drugstore, also known as cyanide, for cleaning purposes. And when that didn't happen, a little while later, her parents get murdered with an axe. That shows up in some of the stories of the Borden case. So you could get dangerous chemicals at drugstores because a lot of them were like sort of compounding pharmacies in those days, but there could have been legitimate uses. So I would love to know what that conversation was. Did she say, I've got ants in my room, I need some strychnine? Or did she say, did she express a desire to kill herself? Did he think she was being dramatic? That's a tantalizing piece of information that I feel like leaves me wanting more.
Yeah. Like, did he volunteer that information? Or did the police say, was there anything weird about her behavior? Or did she say anything, or did he come with that information first? Right.
And again, I don't think we have witnesses to that conversation. And it doesn't seem like it's, according to what most papers are arguing, he claims she said that to him on Thursday, which was the day before she disappeared. What happened on that Thursday between the two of them? That she asked him for poison, and the next day she disappears. I'd also like to know why he was ruled out. I mean, obviously he's at Amherst College. He's not in town. I would assume that he was in class that morning or all day or something like that.
Right. But no, that's a good question.
The police seem pretty confident.
Yeah, and not knowing exactly when she went missing, it might be a little tough to nail down an actual alibi, but he was probably spotted on his campus all day, I guess. Mm-hmm. The other part of it is, like, obviously she's never been found. So if she did commit suicide, which I agree seems most likely here, I mean, I guess, I just feel like most people don't hide their body when they commit suicide,
That's the thing. And it's some ways it echoes a little bit what would happen decades later in the Bennington Triangle. You can disappear yourself in the woods, but the clothing that she was wearing, she wasn't wearing like hunting boots. She was wearing street clothes. How far are you going to go on foot on a rainy day in the woods that you're going to disappear so far into the woods that all of these searches never turn you up? Now, she could have gotten on a trolley and gone down to Mount Tom, or some other place. But there was really exhaustive searches. It doesn't mean it's not impossible. Again, the police stated that they believe that she had, in fact, gone off into the woods. But it's also possible she jumped in the river and they didn't find her. If you look at missing persons cases from this part of Massachusetts, there are some more recent cases of people who jumped into the river from a bridge much farther north along the Connecticut River, who the evidence would suggest they jumped. There was a car parked near the bridge. The person was not found. These are later 20th century cases, but it does seem like there is some precedent of people disappearing in the Connecticut River and never being found. But what's important is that when you travel south from Northampton on the river, it passes through multiple towns and cities. I mean, it goes through, all of these industrial towns and cities all the way down through Connecticut. And so the odds of a body never turning up, I don't know, it's possible, I would suppose. But again, that goes into the area of sort of forensics that just isn't my wheelhouse, and so I can't look at that and make some educated or precise decision of how likely it was. But I think that seems like a likely possibility. There was a witness who claimed to have seen a woman fitting her description walking near the riverbank. There was a witness, one of these many sightings, someone claiming to see a slicker, a yellow rain slicker floating in the water. But of course, this is after her description was published widely in newspapers. So I think we're left with a real question mark, where if she did harm herself, where did she go?
Does she have any family that's still around?
To my knowledge, no. The Corbetts were in Utica, and it's unclear to me whether there were other children. I think I did a little bit of genealogy work with them. It seems like there was a brother that had died young in childhood, but it's possible that there may be family members in the New York State area with that name. It's not a tremendously unusual name. There are a lot of towns will have Corbett families, so they may not all be related. But there wasn't some large number of brothers and sisters who would presumably have gone on to have nieces and nephews. No.
Well, Ross, thank you so much for speaking with us today and telling us all about Alice Corbett's disappearance and some others along the journey of this case as well. It's really just compelling stuff, and we thank you and are so grateful to have you join us on these shows.
Well, I always enjoy it, and I've enjoyed our conversations we've had, and I think maybe we can have some more sometime in the future.